opens the center, immediately contesting crucial central squares and preparing bishop development for active participation. Unleashing the knight to influence central squares, this is a flexible response, preparing for various pawn structures. Securing central space while preparing for queenside expansion, this advance immediately contests black's knight's influence. Embracing the king's Indian dragon setup now, aiming for swift kingside development and eventual pawn breaks. Developing the knight here efficiently supports the center and prepares for further kingside pawn expansion, potentially eyeing the d5 square. Developing the bishop to the long diagonal prepares to castle and exerts pressure on the center. Commanding the center, white establishes a pawn duo, aiming to dominate the board and restrict black's pieces. Securing the monarch immediately provides peace of mind, allowing focus on developing other pieces harmoniously. Consolidating the center's grip, white reinforces his d4 pawn, preparing to develop further and maintain a harmonious pawn structure. Solidifying the central pawn structure, c6 prepares to support a potential d5 advance and hinders white's knight from reaching d5. Aggressively pushing the pawn cracks open the center, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and gain initiative. Retreating the knight to e8 seeks to reinforce the d6 square and prepare for a potential d5 break, albeit at the cost of temporarily ceding central influence. Fortifying the central pawn advance, this bishop now eyes the kingside, aiming to participate in the upcoming kingside attack by controlling key diagonals. Expanding the pawn chain initiates a sharp positional battle for central control, forcing immediate tactical calculations. Preempting kingside expansion, white subtly reinforces his pawn structure and prepares for a potential pawn storm down the h-file. Releasing central tension with this capture opens lines, though it grants white significant central space and attacking chances. Recapturing with the bishop immediately activates it and seizes central control, pressuring black's kingside development. Redirecting the knight to a more active square, preparing to challenge white's central pawn. Exchanging the bishop relinquishes a powerful piece that commanded the light squares, potentially opening avenues for black's knight. Reclaiming the knight opens up the h-file, potentially pressuring your castled king. Aimed squarely at controlling the vital e5 square and supporting a potential kingside initiative. Unleashing the queen to a more active diagonal, aiming to disrupt white's central control and potentially target vulnerable kingside pawns. Aggressively repositioning the knight to eye weak squares and prepare a central invasion. Exchanging queens simplifies the position, initiating a transition toward middle game maneuvering where black can utilize the fianchettoed bishop for long-range influence. Kinging the center now avoids any immediate tactical skirmishes and solidifies white's central pawn structure for the impending endgame. Reclaiming the king's central post, black prioritizes defending their pawn structure and preparing to challenge open files. Shifting the king proactively prepares for navigating the upcoming central pawn exchanges and potential open files. Disrupting white's central control, with f5 opens lines for black's pieces. Fortifying the knight's retreat secures the central pawn structure and prepares for potential pawn breaks. Black strategically destabilizes white's pawn structure, aiming to open lines for the rook and create dynamic imbalances. Unlocking the d-file for immediate pressure on black's vulnerable center. A bold pawn push, embracing the center and challenging white's central control with newfound dynamism. Challenging the pawn chain with a bold advance, creating complex positional imbalances. Conceding the central pawn structure leaves black with isolated queenside pawns, a long-term positional weakness to manage. White's pawn push aims to disrupt black's pawn structure and gain central space. Challenging the pawn chain's integrity, black reclaims central space, aiming to disrupt white's king's safety and open tactical avenues. Forces a king repositioning, opening a line for white's rook while creating a target on c6. This maneuver reclaims the vital central pawn and ignites a pawn storm threat on the kingside. The knight aggressively advances, aiming to seize control of the d5 outpost and threaten the compromised black king. Bringing the knight back to its natural attacking square prepares for a central pawn push and aims to regain some positional equality. This knight repositions for better central influence and potential outpost on c5, while preparing to reclaim the initiative on the queen side. Conceding the central pawn majority to white's knight now significantly complicates black's queenside structure. Pivoting the knight to f7 creates a formidable outpost, eyeing vulnerable squares and promising to restrict black's pieces. This knight's sortie into the center disrupts white's coordination and threatens to seize crucial squares, initiating a dynamic shift. Unlocking the c-file for black's rook, creating a decisive pawn structure imbalance. Bringing the rook to the open file immediately contests crucial central territory, preparing to infiltrate the weakened kingside. Unlocking the c-file for your rook, while simultaneously pressuring black's isolated pawns, offers a dynamic attacking platform. Unleashing a surprising rook check, black seeks to disrupt white's king position, creating immediate tactical complications. Retreating the king to defend the pawn initiates a tense endgame, where black's passed pawn becomes a significant threat. Unlocking lines and activating the bishop towards the king's defenses is the primary goal now. Reclaiming the central file offers a strong anchor for the rook and prepares to contest crucial open lines. Opening the d-file opens avenues for rook activity, potentially targeting white's isolated pawns and creating endgame pressure. Recapturing the rook solidifies the king's defense and prepares to contest the crucial d-file. Probing the queenside flank, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and create dynamic possibilities. Activating the knight to a central outpost, this maneuver ignites dynamic possibilities and pressures black's vulnerable pawn structure. Reclaiming central presence and preparing to contest the file are the immediate goals after this maneuver. Shifting the monarch to a more active square allows it to support the central pawns. Realigning the king is essential to connect the remaining pieces and prepare for the battle ahead. This maneuver boldly opens the c-file, aiming to exploit the king's exposed position. Reclaiming central space with the knight aims to solidify the pawn chain and prepare for potential pawn pushes. Shifting the knight to the queenside pawn chain unlocks potential endgame advantages. Reactivating the rook on the queen's side offers a glimmer of counterplay, aiming to disrupt white's encroaching knights. Opening the queenside rook to the d-file now forces black to address the knight's advanced post or lose material. The black king steps into a more active role, aiming to bolster the queenside pawns and contest central influence. Unifying the rooks on the open file offers greater coordination for controlling critical squares. Unleashing the f-pawn injects dynamism, aiming to dislodge the knight and seize vital central space. Unleashing the rook to threaten the pawn and potentially pin the knight, aiming to pry open the queenside. The rook now actively defends the 7th rank, eyeing potential breakthroughs. Repositioning the king to the center of the board aims to activate it in this simplified, open position. The rook seeks active duty, aiming to exploit open files and pressure white's isolated king. Seizing the pawn simplifies the position, opening lines for your rook and potentially exploiting the undefended dark squares. Unleashing a desperate king rush, this check opens up lines and forces white's monarch to a precarious square, potentially igniting a fierce counterattack. Sacrificing the pawn to open the f-file and create a dangerous passed pawn is a bold gamble, aiming for initiative despite the exposed king. Unlocking the open file, this pawn sacrifice ignites a furious king hunt and exposes critical weaknesses. Clearing a path for the king allows it to actively participate, but the pawn structure is now severely weakened. This bishop sacrifices itself, unlocking the g-file for immediate pressure against the exposed white king. Repositioning the rook to the 7th rank creates immediate pressure on black's vulnerable king. Exposing your king further after the capture is a risky gambit, potentially inviting decisive activity from white's pieces. Opening the file offers a new avenue for the rook to penetrate and exploit white's exposed king. Unleashing the passed pawn requires careful timing, lest it become a target rather than a threat. Activating the king's patrol on the open files solidifies defense against potential pawn advances. Unleashing the pawn storm on the king side, aiming to pry open lines for the rook and create counterplay. Pushing the pawn creates space for the rook, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure. Unleashing a pawn storm on the king side, creating a formidable shield around the monarch while seeking attacking chances. Clearing the way for the rook to aggressively infiltrate the 7th rank. The rook's check forces the king into a precarious position, opening up tactical avenues. King seeks safety, but exposes himself to black's well-placed pieces, inviting tactical skirmishes. Activating the king is paramount now, as the board simplifies, eyeing central squares for dominance. Pushing the passed pawn forward creates immediate tactical pressure on black's position. Suddenly, the bishop seeks a more active diagonal to harass white's weakened king side. Unleashing a timely knight fork disrupts black's rook battery and opens the king side.